Welcome to my channel. I hope today's story captures your interest and leaves you wanting more. Your continued support truly means a lot to me. Now, let's get started with the story.
The air in the community hall was stifling, thick with the scent of roasted chicken and cheap perfume. I adjusted the collar of the stiff suit jacket my daughter Carmen had insisted I wear. It felt like a straitjacket, binding me just as tightly as the expectations of the 200 people currently staring at the stage. The mayor, a well-meaning woman named Mayor Higgins, had just handed me a heavy brass plaque commemorating 45 years of service to Oakhaven Bay. I was ready to mutter a quick thank you, sit down, and let the blood return to my legs. I simply wanted to go home to my quiet porch and the sound of the ocean. But my son-in-law, Antonio, had other plans. He stood up before I could even retreat from the microphone. The screech of his chair dragging against the hardwood floor cut through the polite applause like a knife. Antonio didn't look at me. He looked at the crowd. He adjusted his silk tie, the knot perfect. The cost of it likely more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. There was a glimmer in his eye that I recognized. It was the look of a man who was about to close a deal. A man who viewed human beings as assets or liabilities. And tonight, I was the liability he intended to liquidate. Before we get into what happened next, I want to take a moment to welcome everyone joining us. If you appreciate stories about standing your ground and protecting your dignity, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that silence isn't weakness. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to follow along with more stories like this. Antonio cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention with the practiced ease of a corporate shark. "Before we continue," he said, his voice smooth, carrying that particular cadence of confidence that only money can buy. "I think we all need to acknowledge the elephant in the room." He smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I looked at Carmen, sitting beside him. She was looking down at the white tablecloth, her fingers shredding a paper napkin. She knew. She knew what he was going to say, and she hadn't warned me. That hurt more than anything Antonio could possibly say. "My father-in-law, Pedro, is 67 years old," Antonio announced, gesturing toward me as if I were a crumbling exhibit in a museum. "He is living alone in that." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang heavy in the humid air. "Well, let's call it what it is. A hovel on the ridge. A shack with no proper heating, no safety rails, and stairs that are a lawsuit waiting to happen." I felt the heat rush to my face, burning the tips of my ears. People shifted in their seats, the wooden chairs creaking in an uncomfortable chorus. This was meant to be a celebration of my life's work, of the houses I'd built for families in this room, the roofs I'd repaired during storms, the community center we were standing in, which I had helped renovate 2 decades ago. Instead, Antonio was stripping me bare, reducing my life to a safety hazard. There is a profound disrespect in speaking for a man who is standing right beside you, fully capable of speaking for himself. It reveals a fundamental arrogance, a belief that your voice is the only one that matters. I watched him, and I realized he didn't see a father, or a craftsman, or a community member. He saw an obstacle. "Carmen and I have tried to talk to him," Antonio continued, his voice dropping to a tone of mock concern. "But Pedro is stubborn. He clings to the past." I gripped the podium, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to interrupt, to tell him that my shack was solid cedar, built with my own hands and stronger than the glass condo he lived in. but I was frozen by the betrayal radiating from my daughter's bowed head. Antonio turned to face the crowd fully, opening his arms as if inviting them into a conspiracy of benevolence. So tonight, in front of all of you, his friends, his neighbors, his community, I am making the hard decision for him. I'm announcing that we have found him a place. He paused, smiling that shark smile again. A beautiful facility in Vancouver. 24-hour care, all the amenities, medical staff on site. We are moving him next month. The room went deathly silent. 200 pairs of eyes bored into me. Some looked pitying, others confused. I felt stripped of my agency, declared incompetent in front of the people I had known my entire life. At that moment, the thought crossed my mind. At my award ceremony, my son-in-law announced I was moving to assisted living. Then I realized that politeness was a luxury I could no longer afford. But before I could speak, Antonio twisted the knife. He leaned into the mic, his voice booming. At my community award ceremony, my son-in-law announced to 200 guests, "We're moving Pedro to Vancouver. That shack on the cliff is a death trap. He needs proper care." But someone in the crowd yelled, "He owns 40 acres of waterfront." He went pale and... Wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that shout from the crowd shattered Antonio's world, you have to understand the man I really am, not the frail retiree Antonio tried to paint me as. You have to understand the land, the loss, and the secret I'd kept for 15 years. Let me back up. My name is Pedro Valeron. I've lived in Oak Haven Bay my entire life. It's a rugged slice of coastline, too far north for the casual weekend tourists and too working class for the yacht club set. The population hovers around 3,000 souls, most of whom work the sea or the forest. We have one grocery store, 2 pubs, a hardware shop that smells of sawdust and oil, and a community spirit that is forged in winter storms. I raised Carmen alone here. My wife Rosa passed away when Carmen was only 6. It was an aneurysm, sudden, brutal, and final. One minute she was laughing at a joke I made about the weatherman, and the next, she was gone. I was left with a half-built house and a little girl who waited by the window for 3 months, thinking her mother was just at the store. I didn't have time to fall apart. I had a daughter to feed. I ran a construction company, Valeron and Sons, though the Sons was just wishful thinking that never came to pass. I built half the houses on the North Ridge. I was honest. I showed up when I said I would. I charged fair prices. In a small town, your reputation is your currency, and mine was sterling. I taught Carmen that integrity is what you do when no one is watching. I took her to job sites, let her play in the sand piles while I framed walls. She grew up smelling like pine resin and rain. If you're listening to this and you believe that families should be built on respect, not control, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it tells me that these values still matter to you. We lived simply. We had to at first, but as the years went on, the business grew. I had 12 guys working for me at the peak. We took on commercial contracts, government renovations. But I never changed the way we lived. I drove the same truck until the rust held hands with the paint. We lived in the house I built on the cliff, the one Antonio called a shack. It wasn't a shack. It was a cabin, yes. Modest. 2 bedrooms, a large stone fireplace, and a deck that hung over the Pacific Ocean. But the foundation was drilled into solid granite. I had poured that concrete myself. I knew every beam, every joist. That house was a part of me, and it was the last place Rosa had been happy. What Antonio didn't know What even Carmen didn't fully understand was how the finances worked. When I retired, I didn't just stop working. I sold the company. But I didn't sell it for scraps. I sold it to a conglomerate looking to establish a foothold in the region. The payout was significant. But money to me there is just a tool. It's like a hammer. You can use it to build something sturdy, or you can use it to smash things apart. I chose to use it to protect. While Carmen was away at university, the town started to change. Developers began sniffing around. They wanted to build high-rise condos, gated resorts, things that would push the locals out. I saw it happening in other towns down the coast. So I started buying land. Quietly. A parcel here, an abandoned cannery there. I bought the old marina when it went bankrupt. I bought the forest behind the school. I didn't buy it to develop it. I bought it to keep it empty. I wanted Oak Haven to stay Oak Haven. Carmen met Antonio in the city. He was a brand consultant, whatever that means. The first time she brought him home, he arrived in a shiny sports car that bottomed out on my gravel driveway. He stepped out wearing shoes that cost more than my first truck, looking at the towering spruce trees with disdain. Quaint, he said. That was his favorite word for my life. Quaint. He sat at my kitchen table, checking his phone every 30 seconds. He asked if we had Wi-Fi before he asked how I was doing. He looked at the view, the majestic gray ocean churning against the rocks, and said, "You could really monetize this view, Pedro. If you cleared those trees, put up some glass railings, maybe a rental suite, you're sitting on a gold mine." "I'm sitting on my porch," I told him. "That's enough for me." He laughed, a dry, patronizing sound. "That's the problem with this town. No vision. Everyone is content with mediocrity." I knew then that he and I would never understand each other. He measured worth in dollars. I measured it in peace. They got married a year later. I paid for the wedding, a lavish affair in the city that made my ears ring. Carmen seemed happy, though, and that was all that mattered. I thought I was gaining a son, but instead, I was losing a daughter. They moved into a penthouse in Vancouver. Carmen stopped teaching. She had been a brilliant math teacher, because Antonio wanted her to focus on their brand. I didn't understand what that meant, but I saw the light in her eyes dim a little every time I visited. Antonio didn't like coming to Oak Haven. He complained about the damp, the smell of fish, the lack of espresso bars. So, the visits became infrequent. Carmen would call, but her voice sounded rushed, scripted. Then, about 6 months ago, Antonio started showing a sudden interest in my well-being. He showed up alone one Tuesday. I was in my workshop, sanding a rocking chair I was making for a neighbor. He walked in, wrinkling his nose at the sawdust. "Pedro," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "we need to talk about your living situation." "My living situation is fine," I said, not looking up from the lathe. "Is it? You're 67. You're alone. This house, it's falling apart." "It's not falling apart. I replaced the roof last year. It's drafty. The stairs are steep. What if you fall? What if you have a stroke? No one would find you for days." He walked around the workshop, touching my tools with dirty condescension. "Carmen is worried sick. She can't sleep at night thinking about you out here in the middle of nowhere." That was his weapon. Carmen. He knew I would walk through fire for my daughter. If he could make me believe I was hurting her, he could make me do anything. "I don't want to be a burden," I said quietly. "Exactly," Antonio nodded, seizing the opening. "That's why we've been looking into communities. Senior living. Vancouver has some amazing places. social activities, medical care. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. I like maintenance, I argued. I like fixing things. It keeps me sharp. It's dangerous, he countered. And frankly, it's selfish. Do you want Carmen to spend the next 10 years worrying every time the phone rings? Selfish. The word hung in the air, heavy and toxic. A week later, Carmen called. She was crying. "Dad, please," she sobbed. "Antonio showed me the statistics. Seniors living alone. The accident rates are so high. I can't lose you like we lost Mom." That broke me. He was using Rosa's death, weaponizing my daughter's trauma to get what he wanted. "Carmen, I'm healthy. I walk 5 miles a day. I chop my own wood." "But for how long?" she pressed, her voice trembling. "Antonio says the house is a money pit. He says you're probably struggling to keep up with the bills. And you're too proud to ask for help." "I am not struggling," I said firmly. "Then why do you live like this?" she asked. "Why won't you move closer to us?" I realized then that she didn't see me anymore. She saw the version of me Antonio had painted. A stubborn, impoverished old man clinging to a rotting shack. The pressure intensified. Antonio brought contractors to assess my property without asking me. Strangers walked through my garden, taking notes, shaking their heads at my wood stove, my single-pane windows. "It's a teardown," I heard one of them say to Antonio. "The value is in the land, but you'd have to clear the lot." "I know," Antonio had replied. "We're working on it." He didn't know I was listening. He didn't know that my hearing was just fine. That moment confirmed what I had suspected. This wasn't about my health. This wasn't about Carmen's peace of mind. This was about the land. My 3 acres on the cliff were prime real estate. If he could get me into a home, he could sell the property. He probably already had a buyer lined up. I tried to tell Carmen. I tried to explain that Antonio was pushing too hard. But she was deep in his fog. "He loves you, Dad," she insisted. "He just wants you safe. Why are you being so difficult?" Trust is a fragile thing. It takes years to build and seconds to break. Watching my daughter parrot his lies, I realized I had failed to protect her from the one thing I couldn't build a wall against: manipulation. He began talking about power of attorney. He brought papers for me to sign, just in case. I refused. He got angry. The mask slipped a few times. "You're being an ungrateful old man," he snapped one afternoon when I refused to sign a document authorizing a real estate appraisal. "We are trying to help you." "I don't need your help, Antonio. I need you to leave my house." He left, slamming the door. But he wasn't done. He decided to ambush me publicly. He decided to use the town's award ceremony to force my hand, to shame me into compliance in front of everyone I respected. Which brings us back to the hall, to the heat, the sweat, and the announcement. "We're moving him next month," Antonio said again, smiling at the crowd. I looked at the faces in the room. I saw Lars, my fishing buddy, frowning deeply. I saw Mrs. Gable from the bakery, looking horrified. They weren't buying it. They knew me. They knew I wasn't an invalid. But Antonio held the microphone. He held the power of the narrative. "It's for the best," Antonio said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "He can sell the property, pay for his care, and finally relax. No more struggling to heat that drafty old place." I started to stand up. My legs felt heavy, but my anger was a hot coal in my chest. I wasn't going to let him write my ending. But before I could speak, A chair scraped loudly against the floor at the back of the room. It was Lars. Lars is a big man, a retired tugboat captain with a voice that sounds like gravel in a cement mixer. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. "Hold on a minute there, Sonny," Lars bellowed. Antonio blinked, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Excuse me, we are in the middle of a family announcement." "Family?" Lars scoffed. "You don't know the first thing about this family. You stand there talking about Pedro like he's a pauper, like he's some charity case you need to save." "I am stating facts," Antonio replied crisply. "James, sorry, Pedro, cannot afford the upkeep on his home. It is a financial reality." Lars laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the rafters. "Financial reality?" Lars walked toward the front of the room. "You think Pedro can't afford to fix a drafty window? You think he lives in that cabin because he has to?" "Lars, please," I said quietly, trying to wave him down. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want my private life dragged out. But Lars was on a roll. He turned to the crowd. "Does anyone here know who owns the old cannery lot?" Silence. "Does anyone know who bought the marina in 2012 and kept the developers from turning it into a private yacht club?" A few whispers started. Antonio looked confused. "What does this have to do with anything?" Lars turned his gaze on Antonio. It was a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "It has everything to do with it," Lars roared, "because the man you're trying to pack off to a nursing home owns it. He owns the cannery. He owns the marina. He owns the forest ridge. He owns 40 acres of prime waterfront property in this town, fully paid for. Cash on the barrelhead." The room erupted. The gasp was audible, sucking the air out of the room. Antonio froze. His face went pale, then red. He looked at me, then at Lars, then back at me. That's impossible. He's a carpenter." "He was a carpenter," Lars corrected. "Now he's the silent landlord of half this town. He kept it quiet because he didn't want folks treating him different. He didn't want people like you coming around." Lars pointed a calloused finger at Antonio. "So when you say you're moving him to sell his shack for his own good, we all know what you're really after. You found out about the land, didn't you? Or maybe you just suspected. Either way, you're a vulture picking at a lion, thinking he's a corpse." I stood up then. The room fell silent again, waiting for my denial. Waiting for me to tell Lars he was crazy. I looked at Carmen. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open. She looked terrified, not of me, but of the realization crashing down on her. "Is it true, Dad?" she whispered. I nodded slowly. "It's true. I sold the company in 2005. I invested it all in Oakhaven. I wanted to protect the town. And I wanted to leave it to you, Carmen. All of it. When I was gone." I turned to Antonio. He looked like he was trying to calculate the math in his head, trying to figure out how many millions he had just insulted. "I didn't tell you," I said, my voice steady, "because I wanted to know if you loved my daughter, or if you loved the lifestyle she could provide. I think I have my answer." Antonio stammered. "Pedro, I had no idea. Obviously, this changes things. We can look at home care. We can renovate the cabin, make it a showpiece." "We won't be doing anything," I said. "You won't be renovating my home. You won't be managing my care. And you certainly won't be selling my land." The applause started slowly. It was Mayor Higgins, then Mrs. Gable, then the whole room. They weren't clapping for my money. They were clapping because they saw a bully get punched in the nose by the truth. Antonio tried to grab Carmen's hand. "Come on, we're leaving. This is ridiculous." Carmen pulled her hand away. It was a small motion, but it was the loudest thing that happened that night. "No," she said. Her voice was shaking, but her chin was up. "You go. I'm staying." "Carmen, don't be dramatic," Antonio hissed. "We have to discuss this." "You lied to me," she said. "You told me he was broke. You told me he was in danger. You made me scared so you could get his signature. Go back to Vancouver, Antonio. I'm staying with my father." Antonio looked around the room. He saw 200 people who would happily throw him into the bay. He turned on his heel and stormed out, his expensive shoes clicking angrily on the floor. Carmen drove me home in my rusted truck. We sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. The moonlight danced on the water, illuminating the shack that was worth more than Antonio could ever understand. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known. I should have trusted you." "You were scared," I said, taking her hand. "Fear makes us do foolish things. But you're here now." Carmen filed for divorce a month later. It turned out Antonio's branding business was mostly smoke and mirrors, and he was in deep debt. He had needed my land to bail himself out. He fought for a settlement, but when his lawyers realized the assets were in a trust he couldn't touch, he folded. I'm still in my cabin on the cliff. The stairs are still steep, but my legs are strong. Carmen moved back to Oakhaven. She's teaching math again at the local high school. She's happier. She smiles like she used to when she was a girl. We're planning to turn the old cannery into a community art center. It was Carmen's idea. I'm just providing the wood and the hammer. Life isn't about the assets you accumulate. It's about the people you protect. It's about knowing the difference between a house and a home, between price and value. Antonio never learned that. But looking at my daughter, sitting on the railing of our deck, watching the sunrise over the water, I know I did. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that true wealth is found in integrity and family, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more stories like this one. Leave a comment below about a time you had to stand your ground. Don't forget to like the video. Thanks for listening.